Hello everyone, welcome to the Stanley Museum of Art. My name's Cory Gundlach, I'm the Curator of African Art. And today we'll be hearing from our Mellon team for Provenance research on progress on our Mellon grant. So thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure to share this with you. I'd like to begin by sharing our acknowledgement of land and sovereignty statement. Just a second.
The University of Iowa is located on the homelands
of the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, Bahoji,
Iowa,
Kickapoo, Omatmanewak,
Menominee,
Miamika,
Miami,
Natuchi,
Missouri,
Omaha,
Wazaji,
Osage,
Jaware,
Oto,
Ottawa,
Ottawa,
Ponca, Potawatomi, Nishnawbe,
Potawatomi,
Meskwaki, Nemahaki, Sakawaki, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Sanish, Nubaga, Nuweta.
and the Ho-Chunk Nations.
The following tribal nations: the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, Ponca tribe of Nebraska, Sac and Fox Nation of the Mississippi and Iowa, and Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, continue to thrive in the state of Iowa, and we continue to acknowledge them.
As an academic institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations,
and the treaties that were used to remove these tribal nations, and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1847.
consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Understanding the historical and current experiences of Native peoples will help inform the work we do.
Collectively, as a university, to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment and retention efforts, acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations.
So I want to begin by thanking the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for making this provenance research possible, and for leadership from Director Lauren Lessing in particular. It's a privilege to serve in this capacity, to do this kind of research at the Stanley Museum of Art. So today's program will highlight research by Dr. Peju Layiwola, Mellon Curatorial Fellow, Fernanda Campos, Curatorial Assistant for Provenance Research, and Abbey Minor, Mellon Graduate Assistant. Their work focuses upon the Stanley Collection of African Art, given by Max and Betty Stanley of Muscatine, Iowa, to the museum through a series of gifts and bequests in 1979, 1986, and 1990. In honor of Max and Betty's intentions, the University of Iowa has used the Stanley Collection of African Art since 1979 as an educational resource to support teaching and research among faculty and students at Iowa and beyond. Indeed, the Stanley Collection of African Art features prominently in several university textbooks on African art history, and it's been used by various Iowa faculty to teach thousands of students at Iowa for the last 45 years. We owe much to the late professor of African art history, Christopher Roy, for placing the Stanley Collection of African Art at the center of research at Iowa, and also for his role as an art advisor to and close friends with Max and Betty Stanley during the development of their collection, which they acquired primarily through art dealers based in America and Europe. Scholars at Iowa and beyond have taught us about the form, function, and context of objects in this collection for decades, but until now, provenance has not been a central part of this legacy of research. While the Mellon Project changes the approach to the Stanley Collection of African Art, it remains true to its original educational purpose of the collection as described by Max and Betty in 1979. It's the kind of research that shows that the University of Iowa cares not only about what the objects meant to people who made and used them in Africa, but also how, why, when, and with whom the objects left the continent and ultimately entered this museum collection. In other words, it's research that considers ethics as an integral component of the educational purpose of the collection. While provenance research does not always provide us with the details we're looking for, it allows us the opportunity to make this absence of information visible in plain sight. We will first hear from Fernanda Campos, who focuses on objects in the African collection associated with Belgian art dealer Mark Felix, who sold more African art to Max and Betty Stanley than anyone else. Abbey Minor will share the challenges of researching terracotta figure sculpture from the inland Niger Delta region of present-day Mali, and wooden memorial sculptures from Kenya. And we'll end the program with Dr. Peju Layiwola, who will discuss her research on a range of objects from Nigeria included in the Stanley collection of African art. So please join me in welcoming them today. And Fernanda, we'll begin with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today and for your interest in our work. To begin my presentation, I would like to thank the Mellon Foundation and the Stanley Museum of Art, in particular, our director, Dr. Lauren Lessing, and my supervisor, Dr. Cory, Curator of our African Arts, for bringing into life this Provenance research project and for giving me the opportunity to be a part of it. I thank Dr. Adepeju Layiwola, Mellon Curatorial Fellow, and Abbey Minor, Mellon Graduate Assistant, for making this Provenance research project an inspiring one, as well as our collections team, Sarah Luco, Manager of Exhibitions and Collections, Sayuri Himan, Assistant Registrar, and Alexandra Janisic, Associate Preparator, for their incredible support throughout this process. I also thank Mavish Farid, Communications and Marketing Coordinator, Dr. Kimberly Tatchuk, Curator of Learning and Engagement, and Ali Tokarski, Assistant Curator of Student Engagement, and everyone who has worked around the organization of this event. It is a true pleasure to work with all of you. Today, I'm going to talk about my work as Mellon Curatorial Assistant for Provenance Research at the Stanley Museum of Art, a role dedicated to track the chain of ownership of a work from its origin point of creation to its current location. Provenance differs from provenience, the archaeological term alluding to an excavation site or find spot, because it focuses on the historical record of ownership of a work of art. This process is a long-term commitment given the typical scope of provenance research and the steps that the research requires, such as detailed review of archival materials, the close examination of objects, and making connections with other individuals and institutions worldwide. Provenance research can be challenging and time-consuming. However, it is an ethical responsibility of museums and collecting institutions that can help to acknowledge the wrongdoings of the past, resist anonymity, and achieve social justice. During my talk, I would share some details about my methodology and present a case study to provide a clear picture of what my provenance research entails. Shortly after joining the Stanley Museum of Art in November 2023, I was asked to conduct provenance research on more than 100 objects from the Stanley Collection of Art, referred to hereafter as the Stanley Collection. This collection is considered the strength of the permanent collection of African art, and it entered the Stanley Museum through requests from collectors Claude Max Stanley and Elizabeth Betty Stanley in 1986 and 1990. The Stanley collection consists mainly of wooden masks and figures, but stands out for its diversity of works from several areas referred to as Western Sudan, Guinea Coast, Equatorial Forests, Southern Savannah, and East Africa. My provenance research mainly focuses on objects purchased from Mark Leo Felix, an African art collector and dealer based in Brussels, Belgium, who became a close friend of the Stanleys and a key figure in the development of their collection of African art. Numbers obtained from the Stanley Museum Collections database show that Max and Betty Stanley purchased almost 20% of the works in the Stanley collection from Felix, which means that he was their most recurrent dealer throughout the 1980s. There are approximately 137 objects associated with Felix in the permanent collection of African art. He sold 113 objects to Max and Betty Stanley and gifted 24 objects to the Stanley Museum of Art. For the past year, my provenance research methodology has primarily consisted of 6 main tasks, including extensive readings, creating spreadsheets, consulting and digitizing archival materials, the careful examination of objects from the permanent collection, and writing contributions for story maps, a digital platform that the museum will use to make our provenance research available to the public. Each one of these tasks has been helpful to plan my work and has allowed me to achieve some short and medium-term goals, which I describe as follows. My provenance research journey at the Stanley Museum of Art began with a short-term project that consisted in comparing the provenance information of 244 objects from the Stanley collection using 2 sources: the Stanley Museum Collections database called EMBARC and the African Heritage Documentation and Research Center, AHDRC, an online platform whose main goal is to, and I quote, register all existing knowledge about the African cultural heritage, unquote. This platform houses over 170,000 objects and provides information obtained from private collections, museum collections, dealers, archives, books, article notices, and auction catalogs, which have become valuable for my provenance research. Although I could not find all the objects that I was looking for in the AHDRC platform, this comparison assignment showed me interesting results for some of the objects in the Stanley collection. Upon completion of this task, I noticed that there were some mismatches in the provenance information of approximately 10 objects, meaning that the AHDRC records were different from the records in the Stanley Museum Collections database. This list of objects is now considered a priority for the same reason, and I continue to follow up on these mismatches while trying to obtain as much ownership evidence as possible. While reviewing the collection database, I also created a list of art dealers for all the objects in the Stanley collection, which reveals that there were 132 objects in the collections database for which information about the art dealer is absent. These results made me wonder whether the information was unknown or unrecorded, so I consulted the Stanley Museum Permanent Collection archives. I looked at the files for the 132 objects with no assigned dealer, and through this research, I was able to confirm the dealers for 65 of the objects, and I digitized all supporting files. Currently, the curatorial and collections teams are working together to put this information in the collections database. Earlier this year, I also scheduled appointments for the Mellon team to view, discuss, and photograph assigned objects from the Stanley collection. Initially, I examined 2 objects per week, but more recently, I have been examining 2 to 4 objects per appointment, depending on the size, location, and condition of the objects. Thanks to the support of my supervisor and the collections team, I have now accessed around 90 objects for my provenance research. Typically, I examine objects and digitize associated object files in the museum archives on a weekly basis, and I document provenance records from other sources such as printed and digital publications and databases as I find them. These steps make it possible for me to compile and keep track of all the materials that I will need in my written contributions for story maps. Once I gather enough information, I start writing about the objects, their provenance, and I continue my research process. My first written contribution for story maps focuses on a Chokwe style mask from the Stanley collection, which I will concentrate on in the remainder of my presentation. The case study I will be talking about centers upon this Chokwe style mask, which provides a good example of the challenges and achievement associated with my provenance research. But first, let me provide some background information on the meanings and use of this mask, which is also known as Mwana Po, a Chokwe term that means young woman. Costa Petridis informs that the Chokwe heartland is in northeastern Angola between the Kwango and Kasai rivers. However, the Chokwe people live throughout northeastern Angola, northwestern Zambia, and southern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Drawing on Herbert Cole, Manuel Jordan explains that masquerades in the Chokwe region, and I quote, adapt and evolve to meet the ever-changing realities, needs, and aspirations of a society. Naturally, The Versatility of Masquerades Influences the Evolution of Chokwe-style masks. In 1984, Marie-Louise Bastin explained that the mask po used to represent, and I quote, a mature woman who had proven her fertility by having a child, unquote, but a shift in African values introduced the mask Mwana po as a representation of a young woman and, I quote, the hope of many offspring, unquote. In this context, Mwana po is a feminine noble mask that honors the female ancestress, while her male counterpart, Chihongo, recalls the spirit of wealth and power. Both masks are danced by men, and their joint performance brings fertility and prosperity to Chokwe communities. More than 2 decades later, in 2006, Boris Vastio defined Po as a multifaceted mask that, and I quote, may represent women in general, forges a strong bond between the mask's owner and one of his ancestors, and dances at Christmas celebrations or political rallies, or workshops on rural development run by NGOs, unquote. Bastien notes that the oldest Po masks include facial scarification marks and teeth filed to points because they were considered signs of beauty. But according to Jordan, the scarification marks close to the eyes represent the tears of mothers who are ritually separated from their sons during the Mukanda initiation or the transition into adulthood. As Bastin describes, other characteristics of these masks include the cross-shaped Chokwe scarification motif on the forehead, chilenge, as well as the, and I quote, eyes lodged in large round orbits and half-closed eyelids sculptured in high relief, unquote. For this presentation, I decided to focus on the provenance research of this mask for 2 main reasons. First, it is part of the priority list of objects whose provenance records in the AHDRC differ from those in the Stanley Museum Collections database. Second, the provenance records for this mask suggest early details on both its origins and ownership chain, including the specific geographic origins and the year when it was first, and I quote, collected, unquote. Drawing on this information, I continue to follow other provenance clues, which led me to both answers and more questions. The Stanley Museum Collections database indicates that this mask comes from the Kakalo area of Chokwe. It has been in the collection of a Portuguese family since 1890, and it was purchased from Mark Leo Felix on March 21st, 1983. The first time I compared this provenance record to the information available on the AHDRC website, I noticed that there was no mention of Felix. Instead, the name mentioned prior to the Stanley's acquisition of the mask in 1983 is that of French dealer Philippe Guimio, who supposedly owned the mask in 1982. After comparing the provenance records from the two databases and identifying this mismatch, I reviewed the files for this mask in the Stanley Museum Permanent Collection archives and searched for supporting provenance documentation. In the object file, I found a certificate of authenticity issued by Felix on March 21st, 1983, and a receipt indicating Max's purchase from Felix in April 1983. As shown in the museum database, Felix's certificate of authenticity indicates that the mask is from the Kakalo era of Chokwe, and it has been in the collection of a Portuguese family since 1890. Additionally, the document also mentions that the mask was collected around 1880, but it does not provide the names or any other details about the person who first collected the mask or the Portuguese family who owned it, let alone who created it. Felix's certificate of authenticity also makes no reference to Guimio. However, among the files in the Stanley Museum Permanent Collection archives, I found a copy of an advertisement showing an image of this mask and the contact information for Guimio. In the hope of gathering more provenance data, I contacted the AHDRC team to request supporting documents associated with Guimio's ownership. After a few days, I received a response in which they confirmed that the source of information was a 1982 advertisement by Guimio. This response was accompanied by an attentive message explaining that the information in the database had has been gathered over a period of 40 years, and thus not all the provenance data is currently supported by written records. As stated on the AHDRC website, the compilation of these materials is a work in progress. Given the scarcity of supporting documentation, it is fortunate that they could help us prove the connection between this Chokwe-style mask and Guimio through a written record and fill a gap in the ownership chain. Thanks to this information, I was able to confirm that the advertisement found in the Stanley Museum Permanent Collection archives and the one mentioned by AHDRC is the same, and it was published in the inside back cover of the volume 16, number 1 of the African Arts Journal in 1982. To this day, I have not been able to confirm details about the nature of the transaction of the mask in between Guimio and Felix, but since the mask is associated with Guimio in 1982 and with Felix in 1983, it is possible that Felix may have purchased the mask from Guimio. After all, they knew each other, and according to the Musical Instrument Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, they even opened a gallery together in Brussels between 1972 and 1975, until Felix opened his own from 1975 to 2001. Given this precedent, I sometimes wonder if Felix and Guimio continue to work over the years, either frequently or sporadically, and if that would be the reason why they're both associated with this mask in the early 1980s, about 8 years after their official partnership ended. One way or another, Felix owned the mask at some point and marked it with a number that is visible on the back left side. So far, I have examined approximately 80 objects purchased from Felix, and most of them, especially the ones accompanied by a certificate of authenticity, show alphanumeric inscriptions starting with the initials FA or FC, followed by a number that coincides with the reference number included in the corresponding certificate of authenticity. In this case, the assigned reference number is FA308. Having confirmed that both Felix and Guimio are part of the ownership chain of this mask, my next provenance questions focus on both the Portuguese family who had owned the mask since 1890 and the origin point for the creation of the mask. Although I have not come across any written records confirming the name of the Portuguese family, I did find some valuable clues on the AHDRC website, which led to more precise answers to some of my other questions. In the AHDRC database, the entry for this mask includes a section dedicated to objects sharing features, which shows details for 8 other Chokwe-style masks added to different collections over time. Based on my own information provided by the AHDRC database, the location of these masks ranges from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City to the Museu Nacional de Etnologia, or National Museum of Ethnology, in Lisbon, Portugal, and other American and European private collections. As I reviewed the provenance information for these masks, it was helpful to know that most of them were first collected by Portuguese individuals and remained in Portuguese collections for a long time. Some of the names mentioned as part of these transactions include military officer Romao and Carlos Romao, who are associated with 3 of the 8 masks. Dr. Machado Cruz, who collected the mask in the collection of the Museu Nacional de Etnologia in Lisbon, Portugal in 1960, and the Da Silva collection in Lisbon, which had one of these masks until 1930. As I continued to dive into the Stanley Museum Permanent Collection archives, I found some records that clarified some aspects of the provenance for the mask, but that also posed some new questions about the information that I had already gathered. In particular, I found a datasheet from 1984 issued by Marie-Louise Bastan. In this datasheet, she attributes the mask to the expansion style and the Kwilu-Kasai substyle from the region of Chasenge near the right bank of the Kwango. On the same datasheet, Bastan mentions that this mask and 2 other masks illustrated in her book, Les Sculptures Chokwe, published in 1982, were created by an artist who worked during the first 30 years of the 20th century. Bastan also informs informs us that the 2 masks included in her book are part of the collection of the Museu Nacional de Etnologia in Lisbon, Portugal, and were collected by Dr. Machado Cruz, just like the information provided by AHDRC, which I mentioned earlier. Finally, Bastan's datasheet notes Guimau's collection of Chokwe-style masks to point out that some of these masks are known for bearing the mark of the artist who made them, or the workshop where they were created. After reviewing this datasheet and gathering information, I realized that there were some discrepancies in the suggested age of the mask. While Felix's certificate of authenticity claims that it was more than 100 years old at the time of the Stanley's purchase and collected around 1880, Bastan's datasheet indicates that the mask was created in the first 30 years of the 20th century. The gap is considerable, up to 50 years considering the earliest and latest age guess, and 2 different centuries and contexts. According to Bastio, great chieftaincies ruled the Chokwe region in the 19th century, and this period, which Bastan refers to as the era of the great chiefdoms, witnessed, and I quote, insecurity and political stability in the region, mainly because of a slave trade, unquote. Contrastingly, colonization in the 20th century put an end to many of the great chieftaincies and divided them among Belgian, Portuguese, and British colonies, subdivided into provinces and districts. These events caused a sudden decrease in the court arts of the great chiefdoms, but led to the survival of ritual arts, particularly masks and cult statuettes. To some extent, learning these contrasting dates took me to an initial point in my provenance research, because just when I thought that I had been able to put some pieces of the ownership chain together, I found myself asking the same preliminary question. What is the earliest provenance information for this Chokwe-style mask? Although these kind of discrepancies and information gaps pose real challenges to provenance research, they should not be a reason to feel discouraged or disregard what we know. In most cases, there will be unanswered provenance questions due to inaccessible, incomplete, or non-existent supporting documentation, but it is in the pursuit of answers that the very essence of provenance research is manifested. To conclude my presentation, I would like to summarize the provenance records of the Chokwe-style mask to confirm what we know so far and show how I use this case study as the example to create a standard provenance form. As mentioned at the beginning of this case study, the Stanley Museum's collections database informs us that this mask comes from the Cacado area of Chokwe, has been in the collection of a Portuguese family since 1890, and was purchased from Mark Leo Felix on March 21st, 1983. My archival research, however, modifies this provenance information. As of today, we know that this mask could have come from the region of the Chasenge near the right bank of the Kwango, where it was created by an artist working in the first 30 years of the 20th century. We also know that this mask was advertised by Philippe Guimau in 1982 and probably belonged to him. Finally, I confirm that Felix issued the certificate of authenticity for this mask in March 1983 and sold the mask to the Stanleys in April 1983. What is more interesting is that Bastan's records point out the artists who created masks closely related to the example in the Stanley collection, which is rare for historical art from Africa. If you are interested in seeing this Chokwe-style mask, we invite you to visit the galleries on the second floor, where it is currently on view as part of the exhibition About Face, African Masks in Iowa. I hope that this case study has provided a better understanding of what provenance research at the Stanley Museum entails and shows, in the face of uncertainty, the aims to share as much as possible with the public. At the end, the value of provenance research lies not only in the level of accuracy for associated information, but in making this information transparent. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would just like to reiterate all of the thank yous so eloquently put by my peer, Fernanda Campos. It really kind of sums up the group effort that we've really been putting in to make this possible. It's so exciting to share with you all. Provenance research is inherently difficult due to the historically common and still prevalent lack of concern about the documentation of an object's origin. An international treaty brought attention to this issue. The UNESCO 1970 Convention on the Means of Prohibiting and Preventing the Illicit Import, Export, and Transfer of Ownership of Cultural Property. This treaty, which I will now refer to as the 1970s Convention, was created to fight against the sale of cultural items. Although it took several years to truly go into effect, by February 2024, 143 states ratified the convention. As per the convention, cultural property includes anything of scientific, historical, artistic, and/or religious significance. Although this is very broad, states are allowed to define their own cultural property. Without diving too much into the legal nuance, the 1970 Convention operates on three core principles, which are preventative measures, restitution provisions, and international cooperation. Many museums have integrated the 1970 Convention into their collection management plans. This treaty was, however, unable to stifle the systematic looting that channeled almost directly into the flourishing art market. Objects before and after 1970s continued to be somewhat sterilized through either no or purposefully concocted provenance. While this is an issue that has important ramifications with art history, museum studies, law, and ethics, my presentation today will highlight objects from Africa and how they came to be collected as art in a museum context. Many of the objects that I have been tasked to investigate have a single line of provenance information, often referring to a year in which the donor procured the object. Due to a lack of further information, my provenance research seeks to contextualize the objects and bring awareness to the active scholarship and concern over the state of archaeological and anthropological destruction wrought by past and current collectors and collections. The Euro-American phenomenon of collecting African art helped to inspire modern artists of the 20th century as they attempted to push and shatter the expected forms of the Western canon of art. Colonization, of course, is another sinister actor in the often bloody yet sterile bureaucratic pillaging of indigenous objects. It is often through this Western economic lens that African art was given value to a new alien audience. As anthropologist and museum director Philip Ravenhill aptly stated in 1987, our insistence on the intrinsic worth of the African object to art, on its plastic self-sufficiency, cannot be separated from the fact that all too often the African art object in the Western museum or art collection is otherwise mute. Its provenance and real history have been lost due to a series of commercial transactions that have brought it out of Africa, and its identity has been shrunk to a stark ethnographic label. It may be saved as art, yet lost as cultural and historical document. This general sentiment, we shall see, allows me to situate two objects into a broader discussion about the importance of documented ownership. These objects are a terracotta sculpture from the ancient site of Genegino in modern-day Mali and a Kingango from Kenya. There are 6 terracotta figures from the ancient, now archaeological site of Gingino in the permanent collection at the Stanley Museum of Art. Max and Betty Stanley of Muscatine, Iowa, acquired these items from 3 prominent art dealers, Emile Delataille, Marc Leofelix, and Philippe Gemio. The terracottas are extremely problematic in terms of provenance and representative of the flippant anti-archaeological attitudes surrounding the practice of collecting antiquities from Africa during the 20th century. These are some maps just to keep us oriented. The 3 dealers mentioned dominated the booming sale of the evocative and mysterious statuettes and masks as shown in the Stanley collection from the 1970s to the 1990s, a period where the popularity of the objects peaked and subsequently waned. Ginigiano terracottas are still currently on the market, with their age and rarity highlighted as selling points. This marketing strategy is a continuation from earlier art dealers. But why highlight those attributes of these specific objects? And why is it ultimately problematic? First settled in 200 BCE and abandoned in 1400 CE, Ginigiano was one of the longest occupied places in Africa. This is incredibly significant, especially when considering the long-standing Western ideas that paint all of Africa as a forever backwards and primitive place. Ginigiano strongly counters this old-fashioned and imperialistic claim. The first permanently occupied site was large, initially 25 acres. The site would continue to grow outwards, reaching about 70 acres. There are about 65 satellite communities, which also radiated from the interior cell of occupation. This massive urbanized network participated in long-distance trade as well as localized crafts and farming. Archaeologists, in particular, stress the loss of vital information that comes with the undocumented removal of artifacts from their original context. A looter digging a hole destroys any possibility of documenting and interpreting the stratigraphy. Stylistic analysis can be valuable in its own right, but the violation and destruction of soil layers and anything that could be suspended within those layers erases any attempt to piece together a complete picture of the complexity of the site. This permanently destroys any potential information remaining from the significant but quickly eroding city. For objects without archaeological documentation, only the beauty and variation of form can be appreciated and recorded, which dealers such as Bernard de Grund and collectors opt to focus on. Stripped of their decompositional space and assemblage context, if any, these undocumented terracottas are relegated to private and museum spaces, informing viewers of a civilization that once existed. Generally, the informational plaques or labels in exhibition records do not provide additional or significant information apart from visual analysis and speculative theories. Archaeologists Roderick and Susan McIntosh excavated Ginigiano from 1977 and again in 1981. Their excavation reports document the extensive looting of the site, noting the unending sea of pits, violating the ancient soil in an attempt to unearth valuable fired clay remains. Journalist Michael Brent, in conjunction with the McIntoshes, illustrated the extent of the systematic looting in Mali perpetuated to meet the demands of the Ginigiano terracottas for the European and American art markets. In his 1994 article, The Rape of Mali, Brent thoroughly documents how the pervasive poverty of the Malian people were exploited by Western art dealers. The 1970s convention, again, could not stifle the historic artifact bleed as teams of local men worked day and night to exhume the terracotta bodies of the past. Even with the problematic provenance, terracottas from Gingeno demonstrate a great variation in form, often characterized by expression and decoration. De Grun, son of a controversial art collector, wrote his dissertation and much of his scholarship on the bodily communication expressed through the forms of these figurines. His process, called into question by Roderick McIntosh, relied heavily on contemporary Malian memory and cultural knowledge to retroactively decipher the meaning of the multitude of poses and appliques exhibited by the statuettes. The figures and masks purchased by Max and Betty Stanley from Marx Felix demonstrate a great range of the different types that have been discovered at the ancient site, which de Grun attempts to divide into several rather amorphous groups, notably sacred gesture and bodily prayer, maternity and fertility, illustration of a Mande oral story, snakes as power, and ornamentation or pustules. This last grouping I just want to draw attention to because it is fascinating. It does seem particularly odd through the conflation of decoration and disease. Using contemporary voices of Malian individuals, de Grun's anthropological approach was entwined with detailed visual analysis to create his typology. While still speculative, his theory is compelling. Perhaps one of the most visually compelling and representative statuettes from the extremely damaged and constantly eroding site in the Stanley collection of African art is this terracotta figure covered in snakes, which was purchased from Felix. Although it is recorded in the object file that Felix excavated the figure, there is no additional information, no notes, and no photography about his so-called archaeological undertaking. Bald, with bulging eyes, a strong nose, and pursed lips, this once seated but now broken terracotta hoists its leg over its shoulder. Slender, winding lines trail down the center of the figure's forehead, along the sides of its head, along both its arms, and along its lifted leg. The gender of the figure is difficult to determine, but there seems to be a suggestion of a breast below the prominent necklace. Although it is difficult to observe because of the encrusted surface, there is also a rectangular pattern across the figure's skull. Snakes, de Grun hypothesizes, can represent either a positive or a negative power, depending on the positioning and resulting bodily expression. Continuing his anthropological approach, de Grun states that snakes were overt symbols of power and connected to royals or subsequently powerful individuals. Snake iconography, however, can serve a darker purpose. Although not depicted on the previous terracotta figurine, there are examples of statuettes being suffocated by snakes as the thick, undulating form weaves itself through the mouth and nostrils of the human. It is unfortunate that the find spots of the Stanley's terracotta was not recorded, a point which I find important to stress. Similar objects have been properly excavated and were commonly confined to niches or under the houses of floors. Without additional context or additional information, the terracotta figure from the Stanley's collection can be sorted and filed and placed with other figurines ripped away from their initial find spots. Turning away from this ancient site, we will now move to a kigango produced by the Mijikenda in Kenya. This object was purchased by Max Stanley in 1970 from Robert Jones, an art dealer based in Indianapolis. Erected by and for members of an all-male semi-secret Gohu society of the Mijikenda, Vigango, which is the plural of Kigango, are tall, abstracted human forms essential for commemoration and ancestor veneration. The form can vary in both size and decoration. Consistent, however, is the humanoid shape, with a rounded form to represent the head on top of this elongated post, which represents the body. Triangular chip carved designs spread across the surface of the body, suggesting both anatomy and architectural wood carving, popular along the Swahili coast. These motifs can be enhanced with red, black, white, and sometimes blue pigments, which can be either organic and now in modern days synthetic. According to scholars such as Elizabeth Orchardson Mazuri in 1889, Janet McIntosh in 2009, and Joseph Nadomski in 2018, Vigango are commissioned at great expense of the family of the deceased and considered to be living entities imbued with the spirit of the respective dead. Creation of the memorial post pulls on both initiation rites and burial practices. Vigango are made from termite-resisted wood in a secret process taking place in a forest. The memorial post is carried from the forest and laid to rest near the site of installation. In the morning, the post is again carried like a corpse and then planted into purified ground. It is dressed with strips of cloth, covered in castor oil, and given a blood sacrifice to wake it up. As a living presence, the post is visited, it's libated, and it is addressed as though it is alive, all to maintain the happiness of the spirit. Perhaps most significant in the context of my provenance research is the fact that the Vigango should never be removed from the associated ancestral graves. Rather, they are meant to weather and decompose on site. Removing the commemorative post is believed to upset the honored spirit, which brings a host of bad luck onto the community. However, since Vigango are traditionally erected at the edges of community, the posts are vulnerable to looting as interest from the African art market emerged locally during the 1970s. A portrait from 1981 of artist and collector Andy Warhol, flanked by his Vigango, illustrates the Western abduction of funerary objects. This image speaks to the fleeting infatuation among many Europeans and Americans at a time with extracted and exotic forms, regardless of the indigenous desires to retain their objects. Like the Jin and terracottas, Vigango followed the convoluted and ethically questionable path from homeland to the hands of private collectors and museums in the United States and in Europe. According to Monica Verardi, Linda Giles, and John Mitsane in 2003, the majority of Vigango theft is committed by young, single men trying to earn an additional income, even at the expense of their traditional beliefs and practices. Although stigmatized for their actions, thieves continue to rip out and uproot the cherished, ritually constructed and erected posts so that they can sell the effigies to the local shops with tourist clientele, which often have connections to art dealers abroad. As with any looting network, objects are sold at an incredibly high markup, an additional insult to the rape of local culture and history. Vigango can be found in museums throughout the United States, often donated by individual collectors. Unsurprisingly, provenance is often not supplied. If it is, the word vague can be applied quite generously. While not a rosy landscape, there has been some success among American museums in identifying Vigango and returning these stolen objects to their original home. In 2019, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science was able to successfully repatriate 30 Vigango to the Mejikenda. However, the well-meaning quest to return the displaced objects was laborious, filled with administrative and financial obstacles, which greatly complicated and lengthened the process. From 2008 to 2013, Stephen Nash and Chip Colwell tried to work with the Nairobi National Museum, but were unsuccessful. Space was tight, and the Nairobi National Museum was unable to accept the displaced objects. In 2013, the pair found out that the city and county of Denver was linked to the city and county of Nairobi through the city's sister program. Through this avenue, the Denver Museum hosted a repatriation program in 2014, which resulted in signatures from 6 Kenyan dignitaries, all in support of the return of the Vigango. Everything was going smoothly until the Kenyan Revenue Authority imposed a $40,000 tariff, import tariff. The Vigango were subsequently stranded at the Denver International Airport for 4 years. No Uber. But Stephen Nash never gave up. In 2018, with some luck, Nash met Purity Kura, the Director of Antiquities, Sites, and Monuments from the National Museums of Kenya. In 2019, Kura was able to have the import tariff waived, and the Vigango were finally able to come home. For the community at large, this homecoming was emotional and psychologically impactful because of the significance and power embedded in these memorial posts. My presentation has demonstrated that even though provenance research is often very frustrating, it is also incredibly and deeply rewarding. Ultimately, some objects will always remain a mystery. Unanswered questions are just a reality. Provenance research deepens conversations regarding historic practices and contemporary legal and ethical issues. The objects discussed here today speak to the importance of research, contextualization, and their role in ongoing conversations on topics such as repatriation and museum responsibility. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good. I resumed here as the Mellon Curatorial Fellow for Provenance Research on the 2nd of January 2024, right in the height of winter. Before I left toasty hot Lagos, I asked Cory, the Mellon team leader, about how cold it was in Iowa. He wrote back to say, and I quote, "The snow is magical." The following chilly days and weeks brought me in contact with very kind and lovable people in the museum. Thank you all for making me feel very welcome. Now to the topic, present state of provenance research on the Stanley collection of African art. Tracking the various paths and objects may have traversed from its original location through the hands of various dealers or collectors before entering the museum collection could be a daunting task. Yet this is such a necessary task, particularly for African objects, many of which were looted during the colonial period, like in the case of the Benin bronzes. The illicit trade in African objects was also fueled by the insatiable taste of Western connoisseurs who worked hand in hand with locals. The destination of these valuable cultural materials were private collections and Western museums. Sacred objects were commodified. The most valued of them were objects that were once used for rituals and religious ceremonies. Thus, the presence of kaolin, blood, soot from the fireplace, and the age of the material were the new conditions that determined their value in their new locations. All these features are present in the checklist of objects I'm presently studying in the collection. For me, this whole exercise, this research exercise, has been a rewarding experience. It has given me the opportunity of working with an amazing team. The feedback sessions have been great, and the mere fact that each researcher's work complements the other has made this a beautiful ride. It has also availed me the opportunity of working with diverse cultural materials from Nigeria, other than Benin objects that I'm more familiar with. I was assigned 70 objects from the African collection for provenance research. 47 out of these are listed as priority objects, all selected from Nigeria, and are ascribed accession numbers that start with X 1986. X refers to the accession numbers of the objects originally gifted by Claude Maxwell and his wife Elizabeth Betty Stanley, and 1986 represents the year the objects entered the museum collection. I have structured my presentation in two parts. First, to look at the methodology I employed for this research, and then to focus on a single object known as Okbo Shongo, or a Yoruba Shongo shrine post. In terms of methodology, I've explored both primary and secondary sources for this research. The first point of call is usually the object file. Since I came, I've scanned 69 out of 70 assigned object files. One file could not be found. These documents include receipts, loan requests, photographs, condition reports, and scholarly documents on the objects. Object viewing sessions were scheduled every week. The objects themselves provide lists through the accession marks on them. All 70 objects have been successfully photographed from different angles and kept in the Mellon folder. We are also trained in object handling by members of the collection team. Also available were various databases such as the African Heritage Documentation and Research Center, AHDRC, that Fernanda talked about, and the University of Ibadan Audio and Film Archives. Other resources include auction catalogs, major exhibition catalogs associated with the collection, art journals, and books on African art, websites, and family records. Since part of our work is to help build relationships with individuals and institutions associated with the museum collection, I have reached out to several African academics, museum experts, including people from specific communities from where these works originate. So when we went on the trip to Nigeria for the return of the two Benin objects from the Stanley Museum, I took out time to visit the National Museum of Unity in Ibadan, and I've continued dialoguing with the staff of this museum. So one of the benefits of provenance research at the Stanley Museum of Art is the return of two Benin objects returned to the Abbey of Benin on the 15th of July 2024. Generally, the emphasis on restitution of Benin objects has eclipsed objects from other cultures that may have been stolen from Nigeria as well. So I'll just go on to talk about my general findings so far, such as wrong attribution to geographies. Sometimes you find in the files, in the MBAC database, Eastern Africa instead of Eastern Nigeria, wrong listing of media or omission of certain material that were used to make an object on the museum database. And sometimes you also have the wrong orientation of objects already photographed in catalogs and recorded still in the database. All these observations have been pointed out, and this will help to make the documentation more accurate. Very briefly, I will give two of such examples. One is the first one is an object which underscores the importance of reaching out to indigenous scholars and engaging communities in this research. The search for the right materials used to make the agwala, or rattle, brought me in touch with communities who speak different dialects of Yoruba language. And here, when I posed this question to a group of African scholars, I got this response from one of them. She even went as far as looking at the website of the university to see how the object was described. And the second object is the Igbo male figure, which highlights the lopsidedness of information where dealers and collectors are better known than the actual makers of the objects. So we'll go on to the main object I'll be discussing today, which is the Shongo Shrine Post, which is known as Okbo Shongo. The Yoruba Shongo Shrine Post is incidentally the first object I studied. It is simply described as a house post from the Guinea Coast, Niger-Congo cultural area. The ritual post was purchased from Herbert Baker on February 16, 1977. This shrine post is a representation of 3 human figures. The bottom figure is an equestrian figure of an Oyo warrior riding a horse. And this is a very popular theme in Yoruba wood carving. Its upper body, which is much larger, is also more significantly sculpted than the lower parts. Also represented are 2 drummers, one larger than the other. And we can see facial marks such as that's usually associated with Oyo or Ogbomosho people from southwestern Nigeria. The multi-tiered format is characteristic of most Yoruba post carvings, also seen in the works of a later renowned Yoruba carver known as Lamidi Fakeye. The top plinth and the crevices of the post are covered in kaolin chalk, showing that it was actively used in a spiritual context. The spotted white designs on the upper part of the post are believed to be in reverence to Shokbono, the god of smallpox. And we can also see some blue coloration in some of the incisions along the length of the posts. The post appears to be in good shape except for the base, which shows signs of degeneration. This portion will have been immersed in the ground while it was still in use. Part of the carving shows signs of abrasiveness, which may have resulted from the ritual practice of stripping off old paint and repainting the surface periodically in preparation for a new Shango festival. This activity is usually carried out by women. So, what is Shango? Shango is the god king. The representation of his power is the god associated with thunder and lightning. Sometimes you find that he's referred to as the 3rd king of Oyo, sometimes also the 4th king of Oyo, who has a quick and fiery temper. He's believed to have great skills in making thunder, and also believed to have brought calamity upon himself and his household, killing his wives and children, and destroying his entire palace with lightning. Shango later committed suicide in Koso, a town near Oyo. It's also a shrine dedicated to Shango in Oyo, where the Alaafin, that's the king of Oyo, is crowned. In some cases, Koso is regarded as a mythical or fictional space where Shango translated from man into a divinity. So Shango posts or Okbo Shango are erected within the altar and are varied in composition. The lower end is embedded in the ground for firm support, and the top holds the beams of a roof. Sometimes it could be freestanding, and Drual states that Okbo or post can be used figuratively or literally. He expands the meaning of the word in the phrase Okpomulero, which means a post that sustains the whole edifice. The shrine post was removed from a shrine in Ibadan. The exact shrine is unknown. The most prominent shrine, Shango shrine in Ibadan, was known as Agbeni Shango Shrine, which was photographed by a German ethnographer, Leo Fribinus, in 1910. Here you have the watercolor representation of that shrine. Subsequently, other researchers photographed the same shrine at different times, showing a gradual depletion of the shrine space and its ritual objects over time. In an incisive article titled Agbeni Shango Shrine in Ibadan, A Century of Continuity, Norma Wolf and Michael Warren throw more light on the Agbeni Shrine, which has ceased to exist in the busy marketplace of Agbeni, where it once held sway. Fribinus described the shrine in detail as fantastically carved, with brightly painted columns representative of horsemen, men climbing trees, monkeys, women, and gods, and in Yoruba mythological thoughts. He described 15 posts which formed a screen separating a courtyard from the inner altar of the shrine. The only image that points to the origin of these shrine posts is in the book titled African Mythology, published in 1967 and authored by Godfrey Parinda. The photograph taken by M. Lancaster shows the shrine post in situ at Ibadan, along with 2 other posts and with a priest sitting in their midst. And there you have the caption on the screen. In the object file, there are 2 comments of great importance. One is a note likely written by Mark Stanley reporting that Siba believes the piece was stolen from a shrine, no show. None of the others have surfaced, end of quotes. Stanley usually drew from Roy Siba's wealth of experience on African art by having discussions with him on new acquisitions. Since the notes were not signed or dated, the Mellon team decided that such findings in the future should have the initials of the researcher who provides information appended to any document in the object file with dates included for the entry. The other information identified as Christopher Roy's handwriting is an instruction to his staff about the post, and I quote here, "Debbie, we must check provenance carefully to be sure it left legitimately," end of quotes. In subsequent letters and references, we observed that Deborah Gabrielson was an assistant curator in the museum. A more categorical assertion about the skepticism surrounding this post is a more recent correspondence between Christopher Roy and Catherine Hale, dated 2012. In this letter, he reaffirms the publication showing the shrine post and goes further to state, I don't believe I've ever exhibited it for fear somebody will get upset. The Stanley acquired the piece well before I arrived in 1978. This post was acquired only a year before Christopher Roy joined the staff of the University of Iowa. The phrase, well before his arrival at the University of Iowa, shows Roy's desire to clearly dissociate himself from the purchase of the object and any controversy that may arise from its acquisition. Furthermore, the email throws light on the shrine post through another object with questionable provenance. It was necessary to look at that object file in the collection to glean further information that might shed light on the shrine post. This object, a Yoruba Bata drummer from the Shango shrine of the Timi of Ede in Osogbo, was sold by Bruce Holcomb to Mark Stanley. Holcomb reassured Stanley that his purchase will raise no inquiries or suspicion, and he writes, and I quote, I acquired this piece from Merton Simpson in 1981. Prior to this, Merton received personal assurances from Dr. Ekpo Eyo, Director of the National Museums of Nigeria, that Nigeria will not make any effort or claim to retrieve this important shrine figure. Merton had agreed to write you directly, and this was written in June 1982. As Holcomb promised, Merton wrote Stanley about his personal assurances from Ekpo. However, there was no letter from Eyo Ekpo, and I consider Holcomb's statement spurious, considering the fact that Ekpo himself had vehemently and persistently decried the theft of antiquities carted away from Nigeria in the period after the Nigerian Civil War, which is between 1967 and 1970. So how did the shrine post, which was actively used in 1967 and before, depart Nigeria to the US? What other sources or resources can we employ to assist in illuminating the journey this object traversed? With uncertain provenance of the Stanley post, the other probable option was to look at sources from Nigeria, which might provide a lead on how the object left the country. So my research led me to the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ibadan. The museum post was acquired in 1977. However, since 1970, there had been a well-documented history of theft of shrine or veranda posts and other valuable ritual objects from major altars and collections across Nigeria. I was informed of a recently digitalized archive at the Institute comprising over 3,000 audio and video files dating back to the late 1950s. Within it was a 1973 audio file of a press conference convened by the director of the Institute of African Studies, Professor Robert Armstrong. This press conference was held with security agents to alert them of a major theft. 16 veranda posts had just been stolen from the courtyard of the Institute at the University of Ibadan. This was the second reported theft in 18 months. 2 or 3 of the stolen posts were carved by a renowned carver, Lamidi Fakeye from Ilaorogun. Subsequently, 17 years later, officials of the same institute, having experienced incessant theft, decided to move the 4 surviving veranda posts located along the corridors of the institute indoors for safekeeping. Philip Stevens Jr. recounts his experience in Nigeria serving as a Peace Corps member. In 1965, George Simmons, who worked in the medical illustration unit of the University College Hospital, notified him of one of the Agbeni shrine posts that he had recently purchased from a dealer known as S.B. Abayomi. George bought the post off the dealer to safeguard it. The director of the Department of Antiquities, Kenneth Murray, who lamented the loss of cultural heritage materials from Nigeria, asked Stevens to secure the shrine with concrete and metal structures, also to prevent vehicles from crashing into the shrine area. The post was then placed in the Institute of African Studies for safekeeping, hoping that after the fortification had been accomplished, it would be returned there. By 1965, Stevens observed that this was the only post that had been removed from the shrine. In 1970, when he visited the shrine again, all other posts, as well as shrine objects such as altar pots and carvings, had also disappeared. By 1971, various inconsistent stories about why posts were removed were narrated to various visiting scholars. And by late 1971, all the posts had been replaced with imperial carvings. Since one of the Abbey shrine posts was kept in the institute, it is likely that it was one of the posts stolen in 1973, or in the earlier 1971 theft that Armstrong spoke about. On the website of the Detroit Institute of Art, there are 7 images of shrine posts taken from the famous Agbeni Shongo shrine in Ibadan, captured in the 1910 images. Statistically, the Stanley Museum post is similar to the shrine post in the Detroit Institute of Art. There are similar white spots on the Stanley Museum of Art posts that can be found on those of the Detroit collection. It was not until Godfrey Parringer photographed the SMA post that could tell for certain that it was from a shrine in the Ibadan. Up to now, the 2 other posts in the photograph have not been cited in any of the images previously shown, and yet to surface in any other publication. The 7 posts in the Detroit Institute of Art were gifted to the museum by Helen and William Mazur in 1984, before the curator joined the museum, the curator of the Detroit Institute of Art. The Stanley Museum of Art post was also a gift. A letter written by Max to Oprah in the agent's file in the Stanley archives, dated the 30th of December 1976, reveals that Betty had offered to pay for the staff as a Christmas gift for her husband. A total of 10 out of the 15 posts originally photographed in 1910 are in various museums in the US. 3 others are located elsewhere. One is in the collection of the Michael Carlos Museum in Emory University, and 2 others are the Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in addition to the 7 in Detroit. So there's a possibility that all 15 posts might be in use. Since the Stanley Museum shrine post does not appear in the Abbey shrine photographs, it may be safe to say it probably came from another shrine of lesser recognition. Fernanda mentioned that the second largest shrine, Chokwe shrine, is located at Mellon-funded, which is not far from Abbey, and he observes this temple has 4 carved posts comprising male and female figures painted blue and a man riding a horse. Another post has a monkey and another a drummer. Could the Stanley Museum post be what Fernanda describes, given that the post and the associated ones fit the description of an equestrian figure, a drummer, and a female figure? One of the other 2 posts, captured along with the Stanley post, shows a monkey chewing on a corn cob. A similar monkey with the same posture also appears on one of the Detroit posts. At the bottom of the monkey is a female figure with a hairstyle woven into cornrows that radiate from the side of the face over the top of the head. The breasts of the figure are exposed similar to one of the Detroit posts. The similarity in the rendition of forms also point to the fact that all these posts may have been carved at the same hand and came from the same workshop. So I'm going to conclude by saying that by showing you this last slide, and this is a slide of the post in the Detroit Institute of Art. So this is a recreation of the Abbey shrine that has been burned down and disappeared, where 10 of the posts are here in the years. And if one were to extrapolate information from the Abbey shrine situation to this shrine post, it will appear that it was either stolen or acquired through dealing with locals who took advantage of the vibrant illicit trade in antiquities in the 1970s. This case, like many others, raises questions about how to handle African collections which have dubious provenance records yet cannot be substantiated with hard evidence. Thank you.
So thank you so much for an amazing presentation, and to the Stanley for doing, really this still very groundbreaking work, right? We're very early in this process. My question is with respect to the first presentation, this Portuguese Stanley, and what is involved in provenance research. As you were speaking, I couldn't help but think, but what about this family? How did they get it? What were they doing? Were they there? Were they in Portugal? What was their role during that time? So is that out of the bounds of provenance research, or is that an extension, just kind of walking it back even more proximally? That's my question.
Thank you so much for your question, and it's also an opportunity for me to be clear about that. It's definitely under the scope of the provenance research. However, I haven't been able to find more information about it. So far, thanks to the AHCRC database, I've been able to track some of the names that might be associated with the family who owned the mask, but I haven't been able to confirm. It's definitely something that I would like to know more about, and I continue to work on that, but I just I haven't been able to confirm that, but it's definitely part of the provenance research, and hopefully I'll be able to have more information about it to complement what I know so far. Thank you.
It is me, Mason.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
So I want to point out Mason Kellum here. He was a right-hand man in our provenance research around what led to the restitution ceremony in July. So Mason, good to see you.
You as well, Cody. So one of my big questions is how do we as museum goers influence museums and collections to take these steps, and how do we decrease the demand for looted objects as museum goers? What can we do?
Decrease demand in museum spaces for these objects. Well, I think we could all answer this question in different ways. I mean, I think our biggest challenge right now is facing this large number of objects that are already here that have such little provenance. So beginning with what we already have is, I think, the biggest challenge before we can address the future. But part of this process is the development of guidelines that make sure that we're very careful about what we choose to accept. And that's part of a larger effort that's currently also the Arts Council of the African Studies Association just recently released guidelines. What's the official name? Basically, to allow museums without African art history experts to know what is safe to consider for acquisition. So those guidelines on the ACASA website are publicly available, and that's based on, I think, a couple of years of research among dozens of scholars in the field that have worked collaboratively to develop those guidelines. And that's something that the Stanley Museum of Art is also working on as part of this project. So, so your question was twofold about how to prevent further engagement with these objects. So, and again, you know, this is unprecedented in terms of a national guideline for this sort of work, because there hasn't been a unified effort among museums in America to develop those sorts of guidelines. There's been various organizations like the AMD and so on, but ACASA is an international body of scholars, and so this is a new stage of development in that direction. So that's a very good thing. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Well, just to expand on what you said, I think that it's become a huge problem. Looking at the collections in most museums in the West, provenance was not taken very seriously, and when they were acquiring the works, there was really no interest in knowing about those remaining works. They just went down. This what I had the parameters for looking at objects and saying that they fitted into the art, when you can hide your taste that they want to show. For example, those objects that had a lot of killing, or they have blood on it, for example, but they used actively in festivals where the kind of works that were acquired. And so there's total adulteration of the information from the continent where these works are taken. And I think that people are now beginning to think more. Friends are thinking about to present works that have problems. I don't think anybody's interested in getting the Gundlach objects everywhere because of the history around it. So objects that have been validly taken from a particular culture is not as attractive as the ones that have the trail of provenance. And those are the kind of works that can be acquired. So I think there's a new thing about it. People are more aware, because the provenance research that we're doing is like investigative work. But there's so much, and we as Africans, we should realize now that there's so much that we cannot even put together anymore. There's so much history that we lost. And when you talk about excavation sites and how people are digging, because the attraction is to sell these objects to whatever amount that they get, but they lose all the information that is embedded in layers of, the layers of history is also lost. So there's a way in which people are beginning to think in a different way to acquire these works in a more legitimate manner.
Thank you, Cory and Peju, for answering that question.
Hi, I'm Nora Roy. My husband, Christopher Roy, taught here.
Oh. There you go.
Okay, my name's Nora Roy, and my husband, Christopher Roy, taught here for many, many years. He passed away a few years ago. He and I first went to West Africa, to the country that is now called Burkina Faso, in 1970 as new Peace Corps volunteers. And Chris had been an art major at St. Lawrence University, where we met one another. And then he got a PhD with Roy Sieber at Indiana University. So after Peace Corps, we were able to, well, we both went to Indiana University, which I know is Lauren's alma mater as well, and studied with Roy Sieber. One feature that I think never gets mentioned, but is left up to old timers like me, the period of the late 1960s and through the 1970s was a period of devastating drought all through the Sahel. And I surmise that a lot of art left because families were desperate. And so the whole idea of, is it thievery or was it desperation? I think that's a very political topic that hasn't been discussed very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to commend the activities here at Stanley Museum. It's an exciting time for me, and at the same time, I have received the research with mixed feelings. It's fantastic that provenance research has been encouraged here at Iowa. I commend the authorities of the university as well as the authorities of the museum. It's going to give something back to Africa. The director, Peju was referring to, who said that the rest of the posts should be taken into the Institute of African Studies. We used to leave them outside, but because of our experience in the 80s, when many of them were just plundered and we had to fortify the museum a number of times, we lost quite a lot of them. But provenance research would help with further ethnographic study to help and complement what had been done in the past, especially for the works that we couldn't find and we didn't know where their whereabouts. But of course, now we know that they are in particular museums, and the Stanley Museum had been sufficiently courageous to dwell on provenance research and also to be transparent about it, showing it to people, allowing us to know the whereabouts of the works, and getting back results of the studies of scholars who will then help as much as is possible to complement the information we used to have, and also to teach younger generations of students who are still in Africa, who are learning and who are also trying to catch up with the knowledge of their heritage. This is fantastic, and I encourage you and I commend you. I do know that in certain centers they are not as open and as transparent, and this is commendable. This, in fact, is showing leadership as well as integrity in scholarship as well as in civilization. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the presentation of the three scholars. Keep up the good work, as I always say. I'd like to say a word of compliment to Madam Roy. My predecessor in office as Director of African Studies at the University of Ibadan, Cornelius Adekwebwa, was supervised by Roy Sieber of Indiana, and he had very great things to say about Roy Sieber. We were very close, but unfortunately all of them had passed on, so it's difficult for us to fill the gap. But the research that Cory and the others are pursuing here is fantastic, commendable, and I think we should improve on it and show it as a model to not only museums in the United States of America, but also to museums on the mainland of Britain. I'm sorry that Britain, it's an older country in very many respects, but the leadership had been taken over from here, so the father should learn to follow the son in this research of provenance, so that provenience could be linked up with provenance. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and thank you very much for the work you are doing.
Good afternoon, everyone. In July this year, I was on Twitter and I saw the post that Peju put up. My name is Osamame. I am a born and bred up daughter of the Benin Kingdom. And I was so excited seeing that the artifacts that were taken from my place was returned by you and Cory. It gave me so much joy to know that, you know, things that were taken from my people were returned by my university here. Having said that, I just want to ask you, is there a timeline for the reparation? Is it something that is going to be continuous? Do you have a timeline? Is it for like 5 years or 10 years? And is it only for African things taken away from Africa? Do you have that for other places? You know, that's my question. Thank you.
So right now the Mellon team is funded by a 2-year contract with the Mellon Foundation. So we are prioritizing work on the African collection, but the goal for this research is to encompass all collections associated with colonial contexts. But it's not just colonial contexts. I mean, I think one of the things about the objects stolen from the Palace of Benin is that's associated with a military expedition, aside from the colonial context in which that took place in 1897. So broadly speaking, the answer to your question is no, it's not limited to Africa, but we're beginning with the African collection. We do have other collection areas that are just as deserving of this kind of research because the provenance is so thin and because of the sensitivities around the history of those objects from around the world. The timeline, again, so 2 years for this contract, but we're hoping to reapply to extend this research to continue beyond the African collection, but it is a large collection. It's definitely not the largest in the country or the world, but we're talking about thousands of objects, around 2.5 in the African collection. And knowing the importance of this collection in an academic art museum that's been used to teach and that was offered to this university to do that, that's part of the reason why we prioritized it in this way. But just to give you an example of the timeline for the 2 objects that the museum returned to the OBA, began with Mason back in, what was that, 2020?
2020, right?
Yeah, 2020.
After the pandemic.
Right. So thinking about all of the administrative and legal logistics involved in the research, to the deaccessioning, to organizing the return physically, which just happened in July, there's a timeline for 2 objects. 2 objects for which there was robust provenance. And we're looking at objects for which the information is much more ambiguous, in some cases just non-existent. So that prolongs the research and the work for the according timeline. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that? Nora?
Well, I just wanted to ask, have you all or will you present your papers at ACASA, the African Arts Council of the African Studies Association, big meetings. And also, will you have opportunities to visit other museums in other parts of the country and light a fire, a good fire, to get people encouraged to do the same kind of research that you're doing and to maybe affect some change? Thank you.
Great question, Nora. So Peju and Fernanda and I attended the most recent ICASA triennial in Chicago, and the exhibition upstairs that's about the broad importance of provenance research around African art was presented there with my colleague Alison Martino. I just submitted a letter of interest to ICASA to host the next ICASA triennial right here at Iowa. We'll see. I know that I'm not the only person interested in doing that, but that would be in 2027. And we would definitely share our research at that conference if it happens here or wherever else that happens. But yes, ICASA is the main outlet for this information, as well as a website we're developing through story maps. And hopefully the fruits of our labor down the road through an exhibition and a published catalog. But in the more immediate future, ICASA is definitely one of the most significant outlets for this information.
This is a good thing.
Question in the back.
Hi, it's me again. Just for context, what does it mean when you say these were returned to the Oba? Because I've read a little bit of back and forth about where things are repatriated to, and so these Benin pieces are with the Oba. What does that mean, and what does it mean to the Nigerian public?
That's a great question, because it allows me to articulate the fact that it was a restitution ceremony that took place rather than a repatriation ceremony where the objects would have gone to the Nigerian government. So this was the return of objects stolen from the palace in 1897 directly back to the rightful owner. That is a process of restitution. And it was unprecedented in North America because other institutions, public or private, have been working with the federal government. And the government is currently collaborating with institutions around the world. They just opened the Museum of West African Art, MOA, formerly known as EMOA, to showcase large numbers of these objects on loan, right? On loan. We returned them directly to the rightful owner, to the Oba, the descendant of the family that was attacked by the British. And so this is a process of returning stolen property to the rightful owner, to the Oba, rather than returning it to the current day government. So it's an important distinction to make. What does it mean to the Nigerian public?
Yeah, it means a lot. That restitution effort was taking the works back to the very place where they were looted in 1897. That was very significant. And also to say that the king is still on the throne. Kingship is passed on from father to son, to first son. So this is the great-great-grandson of the king that was exiled by the British for the works to be looted from the palace. And we must realize that this was a very violent expedition where thousands of people were killed to remove these items. Palace festivals still occur. There are rituals that still go on. There are festivals that still go on in Benin City, in the same palace. The king is still on the throne. So these are valuable materials to the culture, and I want you to look online to see when some of these objects were returned to the Oba of Benin and how he reacted. And it just shows you that there's a difference between having these as objects in the museum and having them as cultural sacred materials within the context of the culture that produced them and has value for them. And so that's a very strong distinction between how they are kept in this kind of spaces. We wear gloves as curators holding them, but when they get to the place where they were made and where they have value, then they have life, So for the people of Nigeria, like my sister over there expressed that she was very happy to see this. And for it to come from her own university. So this is a difference between giving to the Nigerian state. This is not to say that the King of Benin is not working with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments that's in charge of antiquities and such and monuments and things that are of this kind, but to say that it was important that we deal directly with the king. So if these works were not looted in 1897, where would they be? They would still have been with the King of Benin. So that is so significant, and I thank the Stanley Museum of Art for making this happen. I did not think it would happen in my lifetime. And for me to be part of that process was very emotional and very satisfying. I feel very fulfilled that I was part of this process, and to partner with people who are very sincere and honest about doing this kind of valuable work.
Any other questions?
Yeah, can you help us draw a picture of how popular provenance research is around the country and around the world? I mean, from the scale of non-existent to it's the next big thing in the museum world, where does it sit? And is it unique to educational museums, or is it throughout?
That's a great question. The popularity of provenance research. Well, my mind goes immediately to Mellon support for other institutions in America, like the Fowler Museum at UCLA, and the fact that private support is making this possible. There is no federal support for it like you see in Germany with robust provenance research. So through private support, it has increased the popularity. I think that also has to do with our rise of in awareness for the importance of social justice and reconciling with collections associated with colonial contexts. So that social movement has bolstered interest in this kind of research, and people like Mellon are supporting that. In terms of its popularity, I see places with curators of provenance research. Peju and I just met with the Art Institute of Chicago's curator of provenance research, Jacques Schumacher from the V&A. I believe that could be a first role for that institution. I think that the momentum is gaining, but I don't necessarily think it's become a standard. There are museums without any sort of serious investment in this kind of work. But I also see the appeal and that's spreading, so I'm happy to see that. But we're also in the beginning stages of this movement. Thank you for that question. Any others? Okay. Well, I guess that's a wrap. Thanks for coming today.